So if you haven't met, our intern for next year, Danielle Cox, is here with her dad, Danny Cox, from Houston, Texas. So if you haven't had a chance to meet Danny's dad, it's very seldom that we actually have a chance for the students' parents to visit their place of internship. So Danny, we're glad to have you with us in worship this morning, and equally glad that Danielle will be joining us next fall, although she has promised to be here to help with the fair. So I think this is the first Sunday you've been here and we haven't had a marketing committee meeting. So
Yes.
certainly use her. It was her minor in college was public relations, so I am looking forward to the contribution she will make in many areas of our ministry. So good morning to everybody. As you know, I had some problems with the text last week, and Paul cursing everyone who didn't exactly agree with his potential version of the gospel. Well, this week I have to say I'm on Paul's side, and I want to explain to you why. The title of the sermon is, Can People Really Change? Can people really change? I thought about the different times in history when people who have been not only accused, but certainly convicted and known for their horrific deeds. I think of the woman in Texas, Carla Faye Tucker, who was committed some horrible murders and was pleading for mercy from the state's governor, claiming that she had had this miraculous conversion. There were several churches even who wrote into the governor to say that she had made this huge change in her life, that she shouldn't be killed. And of course we know that that sentence of execution was ultimately carried out. I remember years ago reading about the former governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who claimed that he had suddenly had a vision from on high, if you will, and was now fully in favor of civil rights. This from the man who stood in the State House door declaring segregation now, segregation forever. It was hard for me to imagine that this man somehow had changed his ways and was going to be able to move forward with any kind of credibility in the midst of the people that he had once persecuted. I also think of Malcolm X, who at one point in time embraced the anti-white rhetoric of the Nation of Islam until he made his own pilgrimage to Mecca and learned that the Islam that the Nation of Islam was practicing was not actually Orthodox Islam, and he became more focused on justice for all people, on the unity of all people. He even began to reach out to Martin Luther King. They were much closer than many people thought they were, but after all of the rhetoric that he had put forth, there were a lot of people who just couldn't believe that Malcolm X actually had come to a different understanding of the role of Islam and of the relationship that should be had between blacks and whites. He still preached for justice, but his hateful language was often not forgotten. So can it possibly be that this Pharisee, this Paul, who had openly persecuted the Christians on behalf of the Jewish people, the Jewish temple leaders, rather, not necessarily the Jewish people, Paul was standing nearby when they first stoned Stephen. And it was at Paul's feet, Acts tells us, that Stephen's clothes were tossed. And from that moment in the book of Acts, we have some very explicit and horrific understanding of exactly the kinds of persecution that Paul himself not only supported, but validated, using his training as a Pharisee and accusing these Christians of having forsaken the law of Moses and having forsaken the Jewish tradition. Paul was not just an innocent bystander, he was a proactive persecutor of the Christian church. So for Paul to now say, and in the letter to the Galatians, a lot of these details that you'll find in the early chapters of Acts are kind of glossed over. My former life in Judaism, I persecuted these people. Well, Paul, actually, the story is a lot uglier than what you're sharing with the Galatian people. But Paul realizes a couple of things. Number one, that he has been called not necessarily to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Jewish people, but rather he has been called to preach to the Gentile world. A world that in some cases resists accepting the gospel of Jesus Christ because the church at Jerusalem, led by the disciples, Peter in particular, and Jesus' brother James, are preaching that one cannot become Christian unless one accepts Jewish law, is compliant with the Torah, and most importantly, one accepts the requirement to become circumcised. So a good part of the rest of Galatians will have this common argument around whether or not one has to be circumcised or whether one has to become a Jew in order to actually become a member of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul understands that he has a different task, a different message. And so what seems like arrogance on one part, I did not meet with anybody after my conversion. No one in Jerusalem. Instead, I went off to parts of Syria. Damascus, as you know, is in Syria. So Paul, after his conversion, actually goes to the home of a disciple and lives there for quite a bit of time while he is discipled and trained and taught about the things that he has spoken so horribly against. Paul makes that point for a couple of reasons. Number one, he wants to validate his own relationship with Jesus Christ, even though he wasn't one of the 12, even though he never really studied or walked or lived with Jesus as the others did. That's their claim to their authentic gospel. He had that one unique experience on the road to Damascus that he considers to be just as valid, just as powerful as the other disciples' in-person kind of connection with Jesus. But he also wants the people to whom he's writing to remember that he was not connected with a group who said, you can't be a part of us unless you first become Jewish. So his autonomy from that group really is establishing his credibility with the Gentile world. So what would you think of Paul if you were one of those Christians in Jerusalem? What would you think if you had heard that all of a sudden this Paul, whom you were taught to steer clear of, whom you simply couldn't believe would act in such vicious and complicit ways with the powers of Rome? Paul was a Roman citizen, and so he had additional power that he could leverage in ways that many of the original Christians who were not Roman citizens could not. What would you think of Paul? Would you see him as George Wallace, still standing in the State House door? Would you believe that he, like Carla Faye Tucker, had had some sort of monumental conversion that somehow made everything he said different from that point on? Do you know people in your life who have done things for which they're very sorry? Are you able to see beyond their past transgressions and actually believe that somehow they've had some kind of spiritual awakening? How indeed can we even tell whether people have really changed? Let me offer a couple of things that we can look at Paul as maybe a template for not judging, but maybe discerning whether or not people have made real change. Number one, humility. When people have experienced profound internal change, usually a hallmark of that is humility, led and fed by an overwhelming sense of regret and sorrow and guilt for what they have done previously. While Paul sought to differentiate himself from the Jerusalem community, and on one hand he's trying to differentiate his own experience with Jesus as being even unique from those original 12, he's actually to be commended for not just immediately rushing out and trumpeting the fact that he's now on the other side, that he's now one of the good guys. He does not actually hit the road and start his own campaign saying, listen to me now, I have found the true way. Instead, for a few years, Paul keeps his head down. He is growing spiritually, he is learning, and despite his claim that he hasn't talked to anyone in Jerusalem and that he has heard directly from Jesus himself, the reality is that even Paul was personally discipled and encouraged and in a way trained by one of those early Christians. He had to learn the gospel from someone. He had to hear the stories of Jesus from someone. And so Paul was discipled in a private home, and then he lived in a community in Syria where he very quietly went about the work of sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ and sharing his own testimony. He doesn't in any of his letters really refer in great detail to what happened in that earlier time. There are no letters to the church in Syria, at least none that we found. And so Paul, while he boasts of his relationship with the church in all of these letters that we have available to us in the New Testament, we do know that Paul, at least in the beginning, kept his head down, was humble, and did the work that he needed to do so that he would have the credibility that he needed to have with the people of God as he traveled forward. He understood that there was a greater purpose working, and for this we give thanks to know that sometimes it just pays to keep your mouth shut and do the work you're supposed to do so that you can merge with credibility and thoughtfulness. This keeping one's head down, this submitting oneself to learning and training and discipleship reveals, I think, a second way that we can look at people who've experienced profound change. And that's real intentionality, a real rededication to a new way of being. People who have dealt with certain health situations, on the recent copy of People magazine, yes, I read People magazine, there are pictures of 3 women who have lost limbs or partial limbs as a result of the Boston bombings. And they wear t-shirts that say Boston, Boston Strong. One woman's shirt says Heather Strong. She's the ballroom dancer that's going to be helped by Dancing with the Stars. So those of you who are Dancing with the Star fans will be learning more about Heather in the year ahead. Intentional rededication. Each one of those women is bound and determined. Heather says, I will dance again. They all are learning what it's like to be without a part of a limb. They all speak to the lessons learned when a change has been imposed upon you from without, and you have to figure out, how do I go on? How do I carry on? Malcolm X has credibility today because of the way he lived his life after Mecca, the bridges that he built after Mecca. Even as some of his words to his community are still embraced pre-Mecca, it was his actions, his embracing of so many different communities after Mecca. He didn't just talk about it, he extended his hand. Malcolm was a strong critique of the Nation of Islam. There are many who say that the Nation of Islam participated in the plans of his assassination, but it was Malcolm's actions, not so much his words, that gave him credibility after his profound change. That's probably the problem with George Wallace. We did see an intentional redirection of activity. We heard a lot of talk in his presidential campaign, but we didn't really see him embracing the community that he had once hated and persecuted. It was hard to forget the images and the words and the actions because he gave us no new words, no new images, no new relationships in which we could see reflected an intentional will, an intentional desire to somehow be something different. But Paul spent time alone, paid attention to the people who could mentor him, told the truth of the gospel, understood that he was not called to the same thing that the original disciples were, but took the time alone not just to be humble, but to learn what he needed to learn, so that when he did begin to travel and open his mouth, that he had been trained, that he understood what exactly was at stake. And of course we know that from Paul we have some of the strongest apologetics of the Christian gospel ever written down. Paul becomes at one and comments often that he takes in his body, and some of us find it uncomfortable to even think about, but Paul says, I bear in my body the marks of Jesus Christ. Paul experienced a lot of jailing and physical persecution. I'm sure he thought often about how he had often been the instigator of such persecution for so many other people. And so when persecution came his way, he was intentional about talking about how he had been called to suffer, not because it was good to suffer, but because Jesus had warned that if they didn't like me, they probably are not going to like you. And Paul understood the power of suffering with one's head on straight, that intentional response to cruelty that was undeserved. His own participation in cruelty gave him the means by which he could be intentionally different in how he went about talking about Jesus. And finally, after this intentional rededication, he moved forward with a new kind of sincerity. Paul wrote nearly 2/3 of the New Testament. Quite often we begin to conflate what the Gospels say about Jesus and what Paul says about Jesus. Sometimes that's not a good thing, because Paul's understanding of the Gospel is inflected by his experience with these Gentile congregations, and he needed to present a particular way of being in the world in order, as he said, not to shame the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul didn't have the Gospels at his disposal when he was practicing and teaching and spreading the word. We will be studying a little bit about that conflation in the fall, Feed the Body and Soul. So if you're interested in understanding more about how that could possibly be, that we have different things being said about Jesus in Paul and different things being said in the Gospels, you can join us starting in the middle of September on Wednesday night, and we'll be exploring some of those things. When people say they have changed, we have to look not only at what they say, but what they do. Paul's legacy is one of great love and devotion to the gospel, for which he ultimately gave his life. The words that he leaves to us, even though he is quite often angry in Galatians because people are beginning to pay attention to others whom he does not believe share the proper interpretation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And for Paul, the crucifixion and the resurrection were at the heart of everything. You read every letter that he's ever written to us, and he tells us how much he believes in the power of the love that Jesus expressed by dying on the cross, and the ultimate victory that we all experience because of Jesus' resurrection. Paul also wrote in one of his letters that God uses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. Think of people that you know that are recovering alcoholics or recovering crack addicts. Some of the most powerful ministries in the world have been started and are prospering now by people who have been in places so dark that we'll never know the full extent. It's often at the point of your very pain, the point of your own difficulty, that you're able to step back, and once you've experienced the change because of Jesus Christ, you are able to share in a way that others simply can't share. I'm a child of divorce. I can talk about that in ways that people whose parents have been together for years never would be able to talk about that. And it wasn't a pleasant divorce. And so my life is inflected by the particular familial circumstances that I've endured in my life. Many of you may have family members who've struggled with alcohol or drugs or have served time in jail, and yet they have made some kind of transformation. They've been able to overcome. I'm going to leave you with the story of one of my former new member students at Salem when I was teaching new members classes. You hear me talk about it a lot because it was probably one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in ministry. Over 70% of my students, and there were often 5 or 6 classes of 30 or 40 people happening at the same time. Over 70% of those students were unchurched. Many of them, this was the first church they'd ever been in, the first time they'd ever read the Bible. I had judges, nurses, college professors, bankers, lawyers, former crack addicts, and ex-cons. One session, there was a young man named, I'll call him Sam, who told us in the first night of the class he was 36 years old. I've been in jail, he said. I'm just going to put it out there. I've been in jail. Been in jail for 18 years. Now you do the math. This young man had gone to prison when he was 18. And you don't serve 18 years in jail and get out on parole for minor offenses. Sam was kind of short, stocky. Clearly had spent a lot of time pumping iron. And he said to us in the class, my mom doesn't think I can do this. My mom thinks this church thing is worth nothing. My mom says I'll just wind up back in jail. And she's just waiting to see when I will fail. He actually used those words. Every week I challenged my class to spend at least 5 minutes in some sort of devotional activity. Sound familiar? Even if you just open the Bible, read something, pray. You don't have to have a fancy prayer. Even if you just spend 5 minutes thinking about God or reading a short passage of Scripture, try doing it every day for 5 minutes, and let's see if we can build up the amount of time that we spend in some kind of spiritual devotion. Now, mind you, most of these people weren't used to that kind of spirituality. Sean came in the next week and said, Teacher Terry, that's what they called me, Teacher Terry, am I still a sinner? Because I'm having a hard time with that 5 minutes. And I try to pray, and sometimes I fall asleep. And I try to read the Bible, and I don't know what the heck it's saying. I then referred him to something other than the King James. But he thought that he was this horrible creature because he couldn't keep up with this 5-minute thing. And I asked, is anybody else in the class having a problem doing their 5-minute assignment? Every hand in the room went up. Then I told him the story about how I and my husband had tried to start our marriage by praying together every night. My husband is a very spiritual being. This was actually kind of funny because he started out praying, and I never was able to stay awake for the entire prayer. He would say, amen, amen, and I'd be like, I would be asleep. And we joked about it, and we thought maybe we shouldn't pray before we go to sleep. Maybe we should start out the day and pray together, which is what we began doing it. And I said, Sean, Sam, it's really not Sean. I always don't do as much Bible study as I would like, but I've never been honest about it until now. Sam showed great humility. He showed an intentional focus on being something different. And Sam was moving forward, not paying attention to the people who were saying, no, you can't. People in that class, instead of being afraid of who he was and what he had done. If Sam had been arrogant, angry, or even critical of what was happening in that class, we might not have taken what he claimed was a change very seriously. But the class brought cupcakes for his birthday, gave him a hug each and every week. Sam emailed me a lot, and I finally found a male in the church who could be a mentor. Sam was so unexposed to the things of the church and in a way developmentally delayed that he really needed someone sitting beside him in church to answer each and every question that he had, because every time the pastor said something, he didn't always understand. Sam today is one of the people who calls new members on the phone to welcome them to the church, and he's also one of the folks who calls you up to say, hey, we didn't see you in new members class tonight. Is there anything we can do for you? What's happening? Sam still emails me, probably about once a month. He's a Facebook friend. And Sam has proven to me that people not only really can change, but that they need us to help them change. Imagine Paul without the friend in Damascus who took him into his home to explain everything that needed to happen. Imagine someone who had not spent the time with him, really helping him understand what Jesus was all about. Imagine even Peter, with whom we visited for 15 days a few years later. Imagine if Peter hadn't even been willing to sit down and talk with Paul. They eventually had open arguments, but even Peter was given a dream to prove that Paul really was right. Arise, Peter, slay and eat. Those things that I called unclean, I've now made clean. Imagine if no one had taken time with someone who said they had changed and really wanted to make a new start. Imagine if someone had not heard your prayer, had not answered your question, and you were really trying to make an important change in your life. Can people really change? With humility, with intentionality, and with some of us to help them move forward, I believe they can. The next time you are tempted to be wary of someone who professes that they are making a change, think about how you can participate in making that change a reality, not only for them, but for the kingdom.